G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we're looking at my team selection for race week 6 ahead of the Miami Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. We'll get straight into how my team performed in China before we look at all the major team selection dilemmas for the upcoming race week. I had 348 points in the China Grand Prix, the first sprint race of the season. And what a sprint race weekend it was. It was our first time back at the Shanghai circuit in 5 years. And there was a lot of optimism, particularly for Max Verstappen as the DRX boost candidate after being kind of in the fantasy wilderness the last couple of weeks, given that the push towards a meta lineup of, say, a Perez, Red Bull and Ferrari was the popular pick. But given the sprint race weekends have a lot more upside in terms of points and Max's typical dominance at sprint race weekends, he was first on my shopping list heading into the race weekend, and he paid off handsomely, 58 points, which was good for 116 across the board. Obviously, that meant I had to compromise on the rest of my team. Stroll, the double Haas guys, they got the boot. In came double Williams and Valtteri Bottas. So there was, for me, a little bit of skepticism around whether or not I'd emerge from the weekend unscathed. I elected to use the no negative chip for a myriad of reasons. There was a weather risk heading into the weekend. Ultimately, the rain only came through on the Saturday. As I mentioned before, it was a circuit we had not raced at in 5 years. A quarter of the grid had not even had one race at Shanghai in their Formula One career. And obviously, the Sauber wheel nuts, the Williams chassis, concerns around that too. Running back markers, there's always going to be a risk of a DNF. So I thought the no negative was primed to use in China. It paid off. Valtteri Bottas had that DNF in the Grand Prix, and it saved me 23 points on him. He also lost a couple of positions in the sprint race weekend. Otherwise, the team was pretty good across the board. Logan Sargent still manages to escape a DNF. I'm sure that luck's bound to run out at some point, but he had 8 points, another good result there. But Max really demonstrated his proficiency, his expertise, and his viability as a fantasy asset, and that consistency held true throughout the race weekend. Those 5 points for the fastest lap in the sprint, those extra positions gained and overtakes, not to mention the sprint win, all points that we're not going to see on ordinary race weekends, but enough to justify having him in my team. So a great result for him. The no negative paid off, and that boosted me into the top 20K from, just inside the top 50 last week prior. So that was obviously a pretty sound result across the board. The other thing I will say, though, is there were a lot of people that ran Limitless in China, and there was some risk around whether or not it was the right time to use it, but those people who took the punt, handsomely rewarded. The popular lineups were triple Red Bull, triple Ferrari, and Lando Norris, good for 456 points. So you can see it was more than 100 or so points on those non-Limitless teams. And all things considered, these lineups, these Max Verstappen lineups, were more often than not the highest scoring non-Limitless lineups. So the fact that Limitless is good for about 100 extra points goes to show how powerful that chip is. The pressure is really back on all of the Limitless users in Miami, and I'm likely to be one of those just because of the fact that all of the highest scoring drivers and constructors from China did not have a DNF, or at least the most popular ones did not have a DNF. And we go to a circuit at Miami where we're only in our third race there overall. Max Verstappen has an impeccable record there, but there were no DNFs, and it's going to be in 2023, and it's going to be typically a pretty warm weekend. I'll be down at the track, so I'm hoping the weather stays good through the whole weekend, but there is a lot of pressure on those picks to do well for Limitless users in Miami. So very much undecided as of right now who comes into my team, but I'm pretty certain about 3 to 4 drivers and at least one constructor are pretty much locked in for now. So as I said, this was my team from China. This is what my team will be once my team unlocks at the end of the Miami Grand Prix if I ultimately use Limitless. And I will still get those budget changes from this team when I use Limitless in Miami. I'm 90 to 95% sure I'm going to activate the chip. My plan from the start of the season has been to use the chip in Miami. I think it's best used in the first half of the season. The longer you leave it, the less powerful the chip becomes, because other teams have enough budget to get towards more of those premium assets to offset those in the Limitless team. So I'm realistically going to run the two locks in my team as of right now are Max Verstappen and Red Bull Racing. I'm more than likely going to have Ferrari, and I know Mercedes are going to, with McLaren, bring upgrades to this circuit. So that could also spell some variance in how the points shake out in Miami. So right now, there is maybe an inkling that McLaren could come onto the radar as a constructor. But right now, if I said the race was tomorrow without knowing how the teams are going to perform or how those upgrades were going to shake out, Ferrari and Red Bull would be the two constructors on the sheet. So let's just assume for now, given I'm not going to activate the chip until I'm certain by the deadline, we'll assume Max is in there, Red Bull and Ferrari are in there, which pretty much leaves for me 4 slots, a couple of which I'd say I'm pretty set on, a couple I'm not so much. Red Bull do typically perform quite well at Miami. Max has won the last 2 races in a row. He's had the fastest lap both times. He's won driver of the day both times because he's come from further back to make positions gained and overtakes to ultimately take out the top step. Do I see Max winning the fastest lap in Miami? I think it's certainly very possible. But for driver of the day, I don't think so. You'd have to see a grid penalty or something that puts him outside the top 5, top 6, the first 3 rows or so, to really make the case for the fans that he's worthy of that award. I think over the years, his success has obviously been to his detriment for driver of the day voting because he is a man possessed out on track. But a win for Max starting from pole, which he's been able to get in every single Grand Prix weekend so far this season, is not going to sway the voters even if he wins the race. So in the very unlikely event Max takes a grid penalty or starts outside the top 5 or 6, I don't think driver of the day is much of a lock as it was in the last couple seasons. I think Perez, though, that back straight for Red Bull, they're going to be lethal on it, extremely high speeds, and it's just the most well-balanced car on the grid. We've got a combination of long straights and slower speed corners, so I think Red Bull are going to do exceptionally well there. Charles Leclerc, I very much like the guy. I know he hasn't really had anything more than, a P3 so far this season as his best result, but he has had consistent returns. Look at that, 37, 38, 31, 34. Just exactly what you want from a driver at 22 million. Certainly on Limitless as well. 30 plus points is pretty much a good result in my opinion if you're able to pick the right driver for that right result. So I'm pretty much locked on these 3 right now. I think as well, Lando Norris, I'm about 80 to 90% certain he'll be in my team. Not just because he had an exceptional podium, a P2 in China Grand Prix, but also because McLaren are bringing upgrades. And I'm going to get more into that in my preview and final thoughts video, kind of what those upgrades mean, whether or not that makes McLaren a meta asset in Miami. But I think he's really building towards something after a pretty slow-ish start to the year. McLaren in general have just not looked like what they were in the second half of 2023. And even though Lando has had 3 scores recently of 23, 19 and that 36 in China, I still think there's more in the tank and more in the car for them to unlock. And I think if those upgrades are able to kind of just build on the progress they're making so far, I certainly think a P2 is certainly not outside the realms of possibility at all. In terms of that 5th slot, a lot is really boiling down to what these upgrades for McLaren and Mercedes look like. I could put Carlos Sainz in there, and I know I can't factor him into this 5th slot, assuming Red Bull, Ferrari are also at the bottom here. But I think his consistency for Sainz has been, extremely well documented in fantasy circles and in F1 in general. He's had 36, 46, 28, and 30 in the 4 races he's participated in this season. He averages more than his teammate and Sergio Perez if we're looking at his races alone. So I think Sainz is a ready-made shot for this 5th slot, which would obviously mirror all of the Limitless lineups that we saw in China. If in the off chance McLaren's upgrades look exceptionally good, and after free practice 1 and sprint qualifying, Lando and Oscar are kind of top 3, top 4, then Oscar would make for an extremely handsome differential. He's at 15% owned, and even though he's had a pretty underwhelming start to the season, his best score so far was 23 points in Saudi Arabia. I certainly think on a sprint weekend, he can certainly capitalize. I know that 12-point performance in China was well short of the mark, not just on a sprint weekend, but for certainly of a driver of his caliber and of his price. But I think if those upgrades look decent, Oscar becomes an extremely handsome differential. You're not going to find any engaged strategists inside the top 5%, the top 100,000K running Oscar Piastri in their teams, and certainly not McLaren either, which is why if I don't go for Ferrari, McLaren could potentially come onto the radar as an alternative, not just because of the fact that they are only 14% owned, which when you look at Ferrari are an exceptional differential, but these guys last season absolutely ate up the fastest pit stop points. Now, I know it's been pretty one-sided this season for pit stop points across the board. Red Bull have pretty much exercised a monopoly over that, but if we look at fast pit stop points in 2023, McLaren were in a league of their own. Just bear with me one moment. I'll bring this over here. Certainly in the second half of the season, they gave it to Red Bull, even Ferrari. It's very much a toss-up from last season, but McLaren certainly were the most consistent outfit from Austria onwards. I don't know if it was a coincidence with those upgrades or not from 2023, but the fact that they were able to bank fast pit stops just shows that they have got an exceptional pit crew in the waiting. And, you know, anywhere from 3 up to 18 points is a pretty decent result for a McLaren constructor, which not many people, much like Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, are going to be running. So McLaren, if they look good, yes, they've looked off the pace, but if there's a time to take a punt on them, given they're 3 million more than Ferrari, a Limitless is probably not the worst idea in the world. So that's kind of what my team could ultimately look like for Limitless. If I go a non-Limitless, having Max, Red Bull, and Ferrari is my number one lineup. I wouldn't have the budget to get to much more than Hülkenberg if I chose not to go with that. So I could just squeeze him in. But there are people I've seen that have been able to get to K-Mag, Sonoda in some cases. But yeah, that's essentially, I think, the bare bones of a non-Limitless, a Max, Red Bull, Ferrari lineup. For the few that can't get to this kind of team, you'd probably want to be pivoting towards Checo Perez as your DRS boost, not only because he is at 13%, a pretty decent differential, but also because of the fact that Red Bull are going to do very well. He's had, again, much like Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc, a pretty strong start to the season on all accounts. His worst result was in Australia, and that was when he was well outside of the podium places. For Red Bull, that weekend in general wasn't a great one, but he's been able to consistently churn out points. I think you can't go wrong with him, Charles, or Carlos. They're all pretty even in my opinion, but I think Red Bull are going to look slightly better across the weekend at a circuit like Miami. In terms of the rest of the lineup, I think you've really got to consider Lance Stroll. Yes, I know it was an absolute stinker of a weekend in China, but he's still getting points and price gains by scoring very few points. Looking at how he did, I could probably actually just bring that up here, couldn't I? 9 points is all it took for him to get a $0.5 million increase. It goes to show that Lance Stroll in an Aston Martin doesn't need to do a whole lot to get a pretty decent price gain. And there's only going to be so few races left until he gets to that $15 million threshold that puts him in the B tier asset class. Once he gets to that $15 million, his price increases are not going to be as big. And you throw in the fact that his results and performances are going to have to be much higher on average to see those price gains. Otherwise, he'll be likely getting, price drops if he's putting in, 9-point performances, 8-point performances. But right now, it's the sweet spot for Lance Stroll. I think for the time being, may as well capitalize on those likely price gains if you can. K-Mag, just an absolute cash cow. The bloke has gone up 0.5 million in every race this season. So I would absolutely think about getting him into your team. But for those of you that are a little bit hamstrung on budget, then I think Hülkenberg, very decent alternative, slightly more affordable, but also comes with The risk of obviously qualifying a little bit better than his teammate, meaning he has to hold station in the race, doesn't really have the opportunity to make as many overtakes and positions gained. But notwithstanding that race pace of the Haas is exceptional. K-Mag, Hulk, some of the highest overtakers this season. So I think that's a really good sign for him. You could also go for someone like Zhou and maybe a Bottas to round out the team. Something like this, certainly more than acceptable in my opinion, if you're running a non-limitless build in Miami. But I think that's kind of where my head's at right now. I'm likely going limitless, and I'll cover a lot of that along with the upgrades and other chips in my preview and final thoughts later in the week. So be around for that. Stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, guys, I appreciate you dropping by as always. I'll see you all very soon.